we're now just about 2 weeks into negotiations between the United Autos Workers Union and the big three automakers.
As negotiations continue, we're learning more about the contentious talks between the union head and Ford, GM, and Stellantis. The negotiations with Stellantis started with UAW President Shawn Fain calling out the chief operating officer for being late, as Fain claims the Stellantis CEO always wants to talk about workers being late or absent. Well, to talk more about these negotiations, we're joined by Jeff Gilbert, auto reporter for WWJ Radio tonight, as well as Brian Rothenberg, former UAW spokesperson who is joining us via Zoom. Brian, let's start with you tonight. What are we learning so far about these negotiations early on and how they're going?
Well, the tone is going to be a tough tone, but admittedly, that was a self-inflicted wound by Stellantis. If they want to talk about absenteeism in the plant, that was a huge softball. But do I think that in the end is going to be what determines whether there's a strike and what the contract is? No, the contract is people's employment terms, and they're going to be voting on those terms of employment and what's actually in the contract.
In a lot of these discussions, we hear them talking about respect, and they keep bringing that up. Is this about respect, or is this just about numbers and contracts?
Well, people are human beings, so obviously everybody wants to be respected. We all want to be respected by our boss, but at the end of the day, it's like from The Godfather, it's not personal, it's strictly business. So as Brian said, no one's going to go out on a strike because somebody is late, but you want to set the ground rules, you want to have a good conversation. But one of the things Shawn Fain has done, and I think Brian could probably magnify this more than anybody else, is he has set the agenda. He has set very high expectations and has essentially said, there is a lot that we're going after. And in previous negotiations, the UAW has played their cards a little bit closer to the vest. So it's a different strategy now.
It seems like Shawn Fain and the Auto Workers Union, they're coming in hot to these negotiations. We haven't really heard a ton, it feels like, from the big three. It's been a lot of talk from Fain, and it seems contentious. Look, the contract does not expire until mid-September. We're a couple months out. Do you think, though, we are potentially close to a strike, or is it going to come down to that deadline?
It always comes down to the deadline. Nobody is going to settle anything before a deadline because their constituents are going to say, hey, if you'd have held out longer, you would get more.
But you don't think they would go on strike? What I'm saying is anytime soon. You think it wouldn't be a strike until September?
Well, you can't have a strike till the deadline. They have a contract right now, so it wouldn't happen until then.
Well, Brian, they've talked about plants being closed, at least 15 plants. They've talked about, the 2009 financial crisis. Are there worries that these negotiations could be used to close even more plants or to prevent unions from being formed at new plants?
So the complication, there's a lot of complications in this. It's not just about the compensation. It's about these EV plants, which are separate contracts. They're not actually under this contract. But the leverage the UAW has to make sure that these new EV joint ventures, which are separate contracts, are either brought under the master contract or they use their leverage to make sure that they are union oriented, and most importantly for future workers, that those jobs pay adequate wages. The problem here is they are separate companies, and that's what makes this such a complication. It's sort of lingering in the background, and we'll see how it can play out as they negotiate. But I do want to remind everybody, as Jeff has talked about, this is ultimately decided by the members. It is not like politics where you either win or you lose. There's going to be a contract. You're either going to both win or you're both going to lose in the end.
Brian, as the former UAW spokesperson, and I know it's hard perhaps to put yourself in the shoes here now, but as the former spokesperson, do you like that these negotiations are so public, or would you prefer, do you think it's potentially smarter to just keep them between the workers and the big three?
Well, it's a delicate balance. I would have liked to have been more public in some ways at times, but you also were, it was the habit of not negotiating publicly, because if you do, you either build expectations or things can go awry in negotiations that you don't expect. You lose a little bit of control when you go public and the companies go public with this stuff. So it's a strategic decision. I think they've done a good job in terms of putting together some of their social media and their media components on it. But at the same time, I think they've built some expectations. But you know what? I mean, that is what negotiations are about. I do think there's a likelihood that they could have a strike. Right now, they're dealing with like the my notes stuff. They're at the table. They're dealing with, attendance policies, and they're dealing with how the sub pay works and those type of things. And then when we get to September, it heats up. That's how it works.
Well, Brian Rothenberg, former spokesperson for the UAW, along with Jeff Gilbert, auto reporter for WWJ Radio. Thank you both for being here tonight with a little insight into these negotiations.
Thanks.